That's wonderful.
Is it on? Okay, good. Hi. So, Japan is back. Or so we are told. Perhaps it's only the Nikkei 225 that is back. And, you know, the theory, right, is that stock markets go up because they reflect the economy really doing well, and not only that, they predict the economy doing even better. Sometimes that's true, but it is not true here. So here we go. So this is the Nikkei 225. This is since 2018. So the Nikkei 225 has gone up 60%, a lot of it in the last couple months. But GDP, which is this line here, it's no higher than it was 6 years ago. So it has not yet recovered from the consequence of Abe's second consumption tax hike and then COVID, whereas other countries have recovered. And this dotted line is real compensation per employee, which is actually lower than it was 6 years ago. This is not a healthy, growing economy. So then why is the stock market up? Because companies were ordered by the Japan Exchange to raise their prices. Now, how do you raise your price of a stock? Well, the stock is really a reflection of profits per share. Profits per share. So that means there's a numerator and there's a denominator. So there's two ways to raise your price. Your earnings per share. If you want to double your earnings, if you want to double your stock price, you got to double your earnings per share. Well, the hard way is to double your profits by increasing sales and efficiency, et cetera. The easy way is to cut the number of your shares in half. So you have all these cash-rich companies that are too poor to pay their workers what they're worth, but they're not too poor to buy their own shares. And as a result, the main reason why the stock price is going so high is just because if you've got million yen in profits and a million shares, your share price is 1. If you got a million yen in profits and you cut the number of shares to 500,000, your price is 2. Mitsubishi today or yesterday bought 10% of their entire shares. So their stock price went up, and then you get the people see the stock price coming up, and then they join to take advantage and sends it up even more. That's got nothing to do with the economy. So if you're a smart investor, you can make bucketfuls of money. But that does nothing for the population, only a very small percentage of which really have investments in the stock. And the foreigners which are sending all this money here, it can go out as easily as it comes in, because you can't keep buying your shares forever. So stockbrokers like to say Japan's back because they can sell more stocks. Politicians like to say this reflects a recovery, Japan is back, which means they don't have to do any reform. But that's not the real story. Japan, the economy is not healthy. Japan does need reform. And just like a blade has got 2 scissors, so the economy has got 2 scissors, supply and demand. And as I told somebody, because of the bylaws of the economics profession and our secret handshake, I'm supposed to say supply and demand at least 5 times tonight. So that's my second time. All right, so let's look at both sides. All right? Economists have known for a very, very long time, and it was a Japanese economist who actually proved it mathematically back in 1961, that in order for an economy to grow smoothly, demand has to grow as fast as potential supply, okay? In order for that to happen, people's wages, real wages per hour of work, have to rise over the long haul. It can fluctuate from time to time, but over the long haul, have to grow basically in tandem with growth in GDP per hour. So if we look at this chart, we'll see that the diagonal line, if I find, here we go, there's the laser. So this diagonal line is where the growth in GDP per hour and the growth in wages per hour are even. You see some countries are above, some below. More and more have gone below in the last few decades, so something's askew there, something's a problem. But now we look at Japan, and Japan's the absolute worst. So the growth in GDP per hour, it looks like it's in the middle of the pack. Actually, it's not quite, but because there's many more countries over here, as we'll see in another chart. But basically, wages have not grown at all. There's this huge gap. It's the biggest gap. And what's the consequence of that? Well, if workers cannot afford to buy what they make, someone's got to buy it, or else the economy is going to be in permanent recession. So who's buying it? Well, the government runs huge deficits year after year after year after decade. So those budget deficits are not the cause of Japan's problems, they're the symptom of Japan's problems, right? Or you keep interest rates at basically near zero for 30 years to try to, stimulate growth, which hasn't worked all that well, but puts a floor underneath the economy. Or you send your currency to the floor because your companies are no longer competitive enough to command premium prices for quality and ingenuity the way Sony used to. And so you try to boost foreign demand for Japanese goods through a cheap yen. So all these macroeconomic instabilities reflect that. Now, while it's very, very interesting, it's not what my book is about, but it's important because it's a stock market thing. So my book is really about the other side, which is the supply side. How fast can a country grow at full employment? And basically, growth in GDP is the sum of two factors. One is there a mic problem? Wow, something, no, that's an antenna, right? Hello? Is it okay or not okay? Good. Okay, here we go. Hi. So how much did we miss? Nothing. Nothing, okay, good. All right, so basically, the GDP growth is how many hours are all the workers together growing, and how much more do they produce per hour. So the number of workers is growing by 1%, and each worker can produce 2%. What? Still can't hear? No, it's not on. Hello. This is a conspiracy. It's unintentional conspiracy? I don't think there is such a thing as an unintentional conspiracy. What? Okay. Hi. Yeah? No. Yes. That's right. We're going to take a vote? What? Hello? Feedback. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right, no more arithmetic because the mic doesn't like it. In order, are people working, are there more people working, or they're working longer hours, and can they produce more this year than they did the year before? Japan, even though the number of people working has grown, a lot of them are part-timers, so that the number of hours of work is about 10% below what it was in 1990. The importance there is the only source of growth in the economy is productivity, each person producing more. If they want to consume more, they've got to produce more. So if Japan wants to have a rising living standard, it's got to accelerate productivity growth, and at exactly when it should, productivity is falling back, which is really bad because you've got a lot of aging people no longer working you've got to support. So here you go. Initially, if we talk about the catch-up period, hello, where is the light? There it is, here we go, right? So this is the period of catch-up. This starting in 1970, because I don't have the numbers from way back, right? But it really caught up until about 1996, and this is, the top line here is the US level, which is a moving target. So this is Japan's productivity as a output per hour as a share of the US. So it peaked about 71%, and then in the mid-90s, now it's down to 59%. This is the EU. It's basically caught up, growing as fast as the US. It's not caught up to it, but it's growing. All right. So this is the problem. How do you get a productivity revolution, which you need if you want to not only raise living standards, but even keep them from falling, right, which is a real problem. Social Security per senior is down 20% from where it was 30 years ago because of budget cuts, because the economy is not growing fast enough to produce the tax revenue to pay for that. When the government thinks about reform and productivity growth, what it really thinks about is, we're going to have some great corporate governance reforms, and that's going to cause the big companies listed on the stock market to become more efficient. Well, it's wrong for necessary, but it's not sufficient for two reasons. One is the big companies only employ about 10% of the workforce. What about the other 90%? Unless you have them growing productivity, the economy is not going to do very well. But the other more fundamental problem is that these big giant companies suffer from what's called the old company disease, which exists in every country, which is that companies cannot be superb for decade after decade after decade. They become set in their ways, and when times change and conditions change, the methods which earlier produced such great success now become obsolete and counterproductive. So you look at Japan's electronics companies. The top 2 dozen, only one of them was created after 1959. And they were very great in the analog era and TV and that pre-digital era. They were on top of the world. But from 2008 to 2020, in the digital era, they did not do well at a time when global sales of electronics were exploding. Every single one of the top 10 had declining sales globally, whether they produced in Japan or produced overseas. Sony tried to produce a competitive PC, tablet, e-reader, smartphone. It just couldn't do it. Right? In autos, you get companies that they're resisting the switch to electric vehicles, right? And now the hybrids have had good sales this year. Toyota's even more convinced it's right. The problem is that companies stick to what they know, which is true in every country. What distinguishes Japan is that in other countries, when the leaders fall down on the job, new companies arise to replace them. And in Japan, that is really, really hard to do. And that's the heart of the problem. In every country, you need a constant inflow of new companies with fresh ideas, and either they replace some of these old giants whose business models become obsolete, or they give them a kick in the pants, which forces them to up their game. So Ford and General Motors are now producing electric vehicles because of the competition from Tesla. So you need a balance between the new companies with fresh ideas and the old giants. It's not one or the other, you need both. Now, if we look at this productivity figure, in most rich countries, 40% of the entire growth in productivity comes from either the combination of the entrance of new companies, superior companies with fresh ideas, and the exit of older companies that just can't hack it anymore. In Japan, it's only 16%. And because of that, the lack of the new companies, that's why the overall productivity is growing much slower than it is elsewhere. So before I get to sort of the good news about it, let's be sure what we mean the same thing when we say entrepreneur. When most people think about entrepreneur, they're thinking about Silicon Valley and venture capital and these high-tech firms. But that is a really small sliver of the overall growth of new dynamic firms. In all of Silicon Valley, there are about 2,000 high-tech firms. In the US as a whole, there are 50,000 of high-growth small and medium companies. They've been nicknamed gazelles after this variety of African elephant that's not only one of the fastest animals on earth, but also one of the most agile. Right? In Italy, it's more than 20,000 across, in Korea, 15,000, Europe. We don't know the number in Japan because the Japanese government does not measure it, has never measured it. And if governments measure what they think is important, the fact that they don't measure tells you something. So what we really need is tens of thousands of these high growth companies that may grow from 50 people to 500 or 600 or 1,000, but they'll never be on the stock market. All right? Now, here's what we know. In the typical country, there's a percentage of the male labor force, and I chose male because the gender gap is so huge in Japan that it would distort the overall picture. But in the typical rich country, about 6% of the male workers create their own company with non-family employees, not mom and pop shops, right? In Japan, it's the lowest in the OECD countries. It's only 2.5. So if Japan could get it up to 4% or 5%, which is not a huge jump as an overall share of the population, that would make a huge difference in the dynamism of the economy. The good news is that the potential for doing that is here. The other thing to look at is when people do create a company, how well does it grow? And what we see is that the United States is sort of crazy on the one end of the scale and Japan at the other end of the scale, others in the middle. And these companies start off more or less around the same size, but after 10 years, the companies in Japan have barely grown. These are among SMEs, whereas elsewhere, they've grown quite a bit. And so it's a problem starting firms, it's a problem having them grow. Now, this is kind of a good news, good news story. The good news is there are trends I'm going to go through which are occurring in society that are overcoming a lot of the obstacles which cause the lack of enough entrepreneurs and the lack of growth. That's the good news. The bad news is that in order for these trends to reach critical mass and really create a recovery, the government has got to take action to amplify these trends and support them. And the government is not doing it except in rhetoric. So Kishida will say, I will take bold action to produce 100,000 startups by 2027. Now, every time a prime minister says, I will boldly do something, you know nothing's going to happen. And that is the case here. And we will go through it. Perhaps if they just stop saying bold, they might do it, but maybe not. But the other good news is that because of these societal and technological trends, the politics of the situation are changing. So I'm going to argue that Japan has got the best opportunity for real recovery in a generation by resurrecting the kind of dynamic entrepreneurship that it had during the high growth era. It's not a cultural obstacle, it's a political and institutional obstacle that lies in the way. So, what are the positive trends? Well, one is a generational change in attitudes. You walk into these offices of these new entrepreneurial companies. What do you see? You see things you didn't used to see even as recently as 10 years ago. First of all, a lot of the founders are graduates of Keio and Waseda and Todai and Kyoto University. I mean, the top-ranked universities who previously would have just joined the ministries or the most prestigious firms. They want to create their own company. They want to build something. They want to build something not only to make money, but to create something that's going to make Japan better. And they're very ambitious. And they expect to have, companies that now sell $100 million, $200 million worth a year. They want to sell $1 billion a year. And you see lots of women there, and they are not serving tea. They are professionals. Why do they go? Because they can't get promoted at the traditional companies. And so they flock to these newer companies. So what's a tragedy for Japan and for women in general is a godsend to these companies because now they can recruit. So the problem you used to have of not being able to get experienced staff, these companies can now get that. That's a really, really big deal. Japan's newest billionaire is a guy named Minami. He worked at Rakuten, and Mikitani, the founder of Rakuten, said, what's the purpose of a company? The purpose of a company is to solve social problems. We make money by finding out problems and solving them. So Minami said, what's the problem? The lifetime employment system, he thought. It's too rigid, it prevents dynamism, and he was right. So he basically, using a web to change an age-old business, which is headhunting, recruiting. And through his website, he's matching companies that want talented people from their 20s to their 40s. In his case, people who earn at least 6 million yen per year. That's his segment. But as of 2023, 2.3 million people have found jobs, switched jobs, to 20,000 companies that needed people who were talented in this or that field. That's a lot of people, and that's just one company. And 221, he went public on the stock market, and that's the day he became a billionaire. Right? Now, so that's one thing that's changing the situation on the ground. The other thing is technology, and people can often underestimate how powerful technology is in changing the power balances within society. So, whoa, sorry. Okay, so, and especially when you have a change in the dominant technological regime, that gives rise to new business institutions. So in the analog era where today's Japanese giants grew up, the leaders of innovation were giant, cash-rich companies that were vertically integrated. They did everything by themselves. They didn't collaborate with other companies. They may have corporate groups, but not with others. And most of the R&D was done by companies with at least 25,000 employees. Now, in the digital era, it's very, very different. For one thing, entrepreneurship becomes much, much more important. So now an increasing part of the R&D is done by companies with fewer than 1,000 employees or even fewer than 500 employees. And the second aspect, so that you don't have to be a giant company to be competitive, produce a new product. How many people think who invented the Pfizer COVID vaccine? You might think it was Pfizer. It was not Pfizer. It was a married couple raised in Turkey, grew up in Turkey, who moved to Germany and created a biotech company called BioNTech, and they created the Pfizer vaccine, but they didn't have the money to market it, to go through, pay for testing, et cetera. And it was the cooperation between a big giant and an innovative startup that together created the successful vaccine. Well, that happens a lot, and that is called open innovation. Closed innovation is the company trying to do it all by itself, which used to work, and that's what Japanese companies are still doing. They're acting as if it was 50 years ago, when it is not. The thing that brought them success today brings them success yesterday, brings them failure today. One of the most stunning figures is the collaboration among companies. So a typical new patent in information and communications technology, the typical one, involves 219 different companies collaborating to produce this innovation and this patent. Isn't that just amazing? But that kind of cooperation is not seen in Japan. And what's the result? Well, a Swiss think tank named IMD ranked 64 countries in terms of what it called digital agility. And this is important. Digital underlines every business sector, from corner grocery stores to brain surgery to making cars, everything. So digital agility is not how much do you invest in technology, it's how much benefit in sales and profits do you get from that investment. Out of 64 countries, Japan came in 64th, despite having students who rank at the top of tests in science and math, et cetera. So there's a problem there at the level of the company, the way they're thinking about company strategy. They're living in the past. Now, the government ought to be helping, but it's actually making it worse. So if I tell you the global trend is to move toward more entrepreneurial companies doing the R&D, and that companies that do R&D, even if they're not in high tech, R&D, research and development, even if they're not in high tech, they still do it. They grow faster, they get bigger, they become more efficient. 90% of Japan's financial aid to R&D goes to the large companies, which are they got loads of cash. That's why they're buying back their shares. They don't need the money. But these new companies that need the money, the government's not helping them out. So no wonder you're not creating dynamic, innovative companies, right? And the result is, so this is the share of total business R&D that is done by companies with less than 500 workers. You see in Italy, UK, France, it's about a third or more. US, about 17%. Japan's down there at 7%. Germany, whose institutions are in certain ways very similar to Japan's, about 15%. So the government is part of the problem rather than part of the solution here. Now, let's look at another area in which technology is changing the power balance and creating new opportunities in politics as well as in the economy. So here you have Toyota. Now, Toyota faces the problem that depending who you talk to, say 20, 25%, whatever, of a car's value today is electronics and software and the associated hardware. And Toyota's no good in it. A lot of these big companies, we just learned, they're no good at it, right? So Toyota now has more, as its first-tier suppliers, has got more software vendors than the traditional parts makers. And these software vendors are new companies. They don't want to join the Toyota group. They do not want to be subordinate to Toyota. They want to be partners, equal, treated equally. They want to retain their independence to be able to collaborate with anybody, including Toyota's competitors. And Toyota has to accept these terms because it can't produce the technology in-house. So now Toyota's got a conflict. Is it pro-entrepreneurship or is it anti-entrepreneurship? Well, it's conflicted. It wants enough entrepreneurs so it can find people to partner with, but not so many that might take away a lot of its business. And if you speak to different people in different divisions of Toyota, they won't agree with each other. So we're creating cracks in the iceberg in big business of being conflicted. They might actually want the government to support more R&D among these smaller companies so they'd have more partners, all right? So that creates a new political situation. The other side of it you see is in e-commerce for reaching the customer. Traditionally, new companies found it very, very difficult to reach the customer because they had to go through the traditional distribution system that was controlled by the incumbents. But now with e-commerce, they can bypass it. So at Rakuten alone, last year, 57,000 SMEs, small and medium enterprises, sold almost 6 trillion worth of goods to tens of millions of customers. There's a furniture maker. Its founder didn't believe in e-commerce. He wanted brick and mortar stores. That's what he was used to. He got sick and he retired and died a couple of years later. And his kids took over the company in 2002. They joined the Rakuten network, and their sales of furniture went from $1 million to $160 million in about 20 years. And that's just amazing. Now that's quite extraordinary. But there are lots of other companies that increase tenfold, 20-fold. So that this, again, yes, it has an effect on living standards and productivity and all the other good stuff, but it also has an effect on politics and the power balance in society. And that's very, very important for the potential to really amplify these positive trends. Very quickly, one of the things that I discovered in globalization, which is that so many of the entrepreneurs that I spoke with, the vast majority, had some sort of international experience, studied abroad, worked for a foreign company, maybe they lived abroad as kids because their father or mother had a job abroad. And the point about traveling in overseas experience is you get that there are many different ways to look at a problem and to solve it. It provides a fluid mind. All right. Now, so what remains as the biggest roadblock? The biggest roadblock is finance. Companies that cannot get external finance to hire the best people and perform the R&D and get the equipment and do all the stuff that takes years and years and years before you have enough sales to pay for it, they need to borrow. What happens if they can't borrow money? Well, it means two things. One is the only people who are going to create companies are people with both brains and money. What about if you got lots of brains but no money? You're not going to create a company. And if you try, it's going to be too small. And if it's too small, it's much more likely to die and not grow well and not be profitable. So you don't try. Or you move to Singapore. You got this trend of Japanese would-be entrepreneurs moving to places like Singapore where the conditions are easier. Now, why don't they have Why don't they have finance? Well, banks don't fund, nowhere, banks don't fund new companies. They don't provide seed money to get companies off the ground. And venture capital, that funds the companies that intend to go on the stock market and become the next Google. The people who fund these small dynamic companies are called angels. Japan's got very few of them. And we're going to come back to that, partly because of its tax policies. We're going to come back and see France was in the same situation 2 decades ago, and France changed. What did France do that Japan did not do? And by the way, this was not cultural. France did not become America or Sweden or anybody else. French waiters are still French waiters. But they now have tons of entrepreneurs. And we'll see what they did that was different than Japan and actually shows how easily Japan could have done it. But the banks, then once the company gets to, say, 10 years old and needs growth capital, the banks should be providing it. But the banks don't want to lend to these new companies. And particularly, certainly do not want to lend companies led by women. In fact, a 10-year-old company with a good track record will pay 2 percentage points higher interest than a 50-year-old company that's really, really mediocre. I mean, the banks are not doing banking. And that is really the remaining obstacle, which needs to be addressed not only by the banks, but by government, and they are not. So, what should Tokyo do, and what's the likelihood of it doing it? Well, here's the interesting thing, that let me go through the example of France first, and then we'll come back to the politics of the situation. So 25 years ago, France was like Japan. It was considered very anti-entrepreneurial. It had a lot of good, really big companies, but not entrepreneur. And France's leaders were very concerned about it and felt they were really going to fall behind if they couldn't do it. Now, it was said that George W. Bush claimed that France was so anti-entrepreneurial, their language didn't even have a word for entrepreneur. Now, the truth is, George W. Bush never actually said that. He might have, but he didn't happen to do it. But it was believable both about Bush and about France. So what'd they do? They created a government agency which became like a fund of funds. They created angel funds, which are sort of like mutual funds in the stock market. In other words, this fund will invest in a whole bunch of companies, 20, 30, 40. Now, most of them will fail. Just like in baseball, you get out most of the time, right? You get out 2 out of 3, you're a star. So most of these companies fail. But in order to have enough successes, you have to have enough failures, because every company is an experiment, just like every genetic mutation. It's an experiment. Got to have lots of them, have room for failure. But the ones that succeed so well that over less than a decade, you can get back 2, 3, 4, 5 times your investment. So they said, okay, if you're a married couple, you can invest up to a maximum of $24,000 per year, because France has this unique cultural attribute that people don't want to pay taxes. This is a key part of French culture that distinguishes it from every other country. So they said, okay, if you invest $24,000, you take $6,000, they call them euros, we're going to call them dollars, off your tax bill. And also your wealth tax, or maybe I'd like to be wealthy to have, tax gets cut. And people flooded in this thing, and the government would certify that these were honest funds, competent funds, you could be safe to invest in. Money flowed in, and now today, in the last couple of decades, France has created 40,000 new dynamic entrepreneurial companies, about 26 unicorns the last time I looked. 2,500 of these are in deep tech, which means they do profound innovations in science and technology and engineering. In 2010, these companies were worth about $10 billion. Now they're worth about $300 billion. The program has worked so well that they actually reduced the incentives because they didn't need them anymore. Now we turn to Kishida. Kishida said, I'm going to do an angel tax, like other people. But what was Japan's plan? Japan's plan was you could not invest in a fund. No. You had to invest in an individual new startup company. Why the hell would anybody do that? If the professionals get it wrong in the majority of cases, why would an ordinary person invest in a company that's more likely to fail than succeed? They wouldn't even know which ones to invest in. Nothing's going to happen. I wrote an article on it called Learning from the French Revolution in Startups. And a friend of mine who's a lawyer here passed it on to Miyazawa, who's the head of the LDP Tax Commission, to think about it before they really finished writing the law. Didn't do anything with it because they didn't want to give this kind of tax break. No one has told me why. My suspicion is spelled MOF, the Tax Bureau, because they feel if you give somebody a tax break, then everybody else will want one too. Although somehow they find a way to cut the taxes of the giant corporations. It's a mystery. Maybe it has something to do with vested interest in power politics. I wouldn't know about that, but there's a rumor to that effect. So here's something, how disruptive would it be to Japanese culture to say you can invest in a fund? There's all kinds of other things. How disruptive would it be to Japanese culture to give more money to R&D to these dynamic smaller companies? Japan does not need to become America or Italy or even France, right? It just needs to do again what it used to do so well and did in the high growth era, in the economic miracle. Have this balance between the entrepreneurial companies and the giants. Now, how would this happen then? How do we move off the dime? Well, think about this. As you have more and more entrepreneurs, which you are having, they now gain enough clout to be able to talk to politicians, to bureaucrats, to push for reforms that will help them. The future does not vote. The future does not pay for tickets at LDP factional parties. However, now enough entrepreneurs are the present that they can talk to these Diet members. And there are a lot of bureaucrats and politicians who genuinely want Japan to grow. For one thing, look at all the seniors who vote, whose Social Security payments they've had to cut by 20% per senior. Now, right now, the LDP rules, not because anybody likes it, well, I guess somebody likes it, but not that many people like it. They vote because the people who don't like it don't vote for the opposition, they stay home, because the opposition is so hapless. But what happens if, as in 2009, the opposition gets its act together and people vote and turn the LDP out of power? The LDP has to fear that that will occur. Plus, there are politicians and bureaucrats who just really want Japan to be better. They really do. They take their mission seriously. I know some of these people. And so they begin to try to make, there's always battles inside the bureaucracy to try to get these reforms. So even if you get little small reforms, that will create even more entrepreneurs. And you have more entrepreneurs, they have more influence, and they create trade associations. And you have a kind of a snowball effect. The question is, they're fighting a moving target, the aging. So it's not only, everybody says Japan's changing. Well, yes, it's always changing. It's always reforming. The question is, does it do it fast enough before the aging really, sort of crushes them? That's the issue. So I think, and before I get to the final sentence, the fact is that experts know what needs to be done. This is not rocket science. All these ideas I'm talking about, I'm really not that smart. I didn't make up any of this stuff. I took it from other people who thought of this stuff. I'm just reporting it and putting it together. Kishida asked for a report of what to do to create these 100,000 startups, and the Science and Technology Council inside the Cabinet Office assembled a group of experts and produced an absolutely superb report that covered all of the issues. It was great, and it was basically ignored except for this very poorly designed angel tax. So it's not a lack of ideas, a lack of solutions, it's politics. But because of these social changes and technological changes and political power balance changes, I think Japan has the best opportunity in a generation to really recover through this another bout of entrepreneurial effervescence. Japan does have a habit of missing opportunities. It would really be a shame if it missed this one. Japan can do it. Whether it will or not, it's an uphill climb, but it's more possible today than it has been for a very, very long time. So I'm voting for the triumph of hope over experience. So let me stop there and let's have a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. If you have a question, raise your hand and maybe introduce yourself.
Should we sit down or should we stand up?
What do you prefer?
Either way.
I think
sit down because I'm lazy.
Okay, then let's sit down. Okay. And you have the mic. So stand up and be recognized. If not, we'll call on people. We'll do a cold calling. Yes, in the back. Yeah.
Yes, good evening. Mr.
Hi.
Katz, thank you for joining us. And it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm a student here at Temple University, Japan. My name is James Radcliffe, and I'm studying international business. I'm personally interested in mergers and acquisitions, Keizai, Gabeto Baishu, and Fudosan, real estate. And you make the case that the government can make policies and programs to promote the Japanese entrepreneurship for the future. And I'm wondering how much of it has to do not from coming top down, but from the bottom up. You made a mention of how rigidity opposes dynamism. And some countries tend to lend themselves towards stability, and some of them tend to lend themselves towards more chaos and throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And I think Japan tends to be a little bit more stable. I think everybody probably would agree with that. How much of this change is going to come from social change in terms of Japanese feeling a little bit more comfortable doing things that are a little bit more out of the box and being encouraged to try different things and new ways of thinking, things that don't always have regimented ways of doing things, because that's what's involved with entrepreneurship. It's totally different temperamentally from working at a big company, which many Japanese people grow up their entire lives looking for. And to your point, many of the Japanese entrepreneurs that we're seeing coming up have been exposed to these other countries, have traveled abroad, where they've experienced different ways of doing things, and their mind gets wrapped around to, well, there's not always concrete rules for how to do this. Thank you so much.
I'm going to disagree with your premise. I don't think there is this endemic risk aversion or conformism or all these other ideas about things that are somehow descended from the 6th century in Prince Shotoku. It's a myth. You know, they did a survey of MBA students in France and the US and India and Japan. And the Americans and the Japanese were closer to each other than anybody else was to anybody else. And they would agree with things like, I want to change the world. I like to fight conventional wisdom. I like to do this. So why do we have this sense that the Japanese are risk-averse and conformist? You know, there was a certain reality to it, which was that back in the 1890s, people would job hop all the time. Lifetime employment was created by the employers to prevent people from leaving them because they'd get a better wage someplace else. And then developed all this propaganda about the company as family. And it had kind of a no poaching pact. So if you didn't leave, if you left a big company, you could never get another job at another big company again. Also, think how poor Japan was after World War II. It was as poor as a modern-day African country. And so a permanent, secure job at a prestigious company really was a matter of life and death. I met with a guy who's in private equity. So my grandfather was, had to walk around as a kid with no shoes. He was happy to have this secure job at a big company. My father hated the company. He hated his job, but there was no alternative because it provided security. He didn't believe this rah-rah my company stuff. But today's generation, they're no longer, the most talented among them, they're no longer willing to do that. So that's one factor, which is, it's not that people are risk averse, it's that the risks of failure, the rewards for success are low. And the consequences of failure are very, very high. You put an American in Japan's situation, they're going to act like Japanese and vice versa. There's certain, like how you've been brought up. But it's the situation makes a very, very big difference. If in America you leave a job to start a company and the company fails, you can get a good job again. Where's the risk? It's much, much less. People talk about, the mother-in-law would not let her daughter marry an entrepreneur. Well, think about Pride and Prejudice. And Lizzie Bennett's mom looks like a very ridiculous person, but she's actually right. If the daughter of a member of the gentry doesn't get a wealthy husband, she's going to starve because there are no jobs for her. How's she going to earn a living? And finally, one other aspect on it, which is that in the 1970s, for reasons I'm yet to find out why, they developed a new promotion system called Genten Shugi, which basically means a negative assessment. And it began in the banks and then spread to other companies. And what happens is that if you do something good, you're just doing your job. But if you make a mistake, or not even a mistake, if you make a calculated judgment in cases where you don't know for sure, and it turns out badly, well then you get points against you in the battle for promotion. So what have you done? You created a situation in which people are incentivized not to excel, but just simply to avoid making mistakes, which just bores the hell out of them, by the way, right? Now, there's this wonderful study by this Japanese economist comparing banks that still have Genten Shugi, which the banks who have abandoned it. And the banks that have abandoned it perform much better, and their individual staff members perform much better, and they're more willing to take chances. So it is not that's not that the Japanese are, its circumstances create behaviors. Remember, the Japanese are culturally, they want to save. That's Japanese culture. They want to save. Anybody know what the savings rate in Japan is today? It's a lot lower than America's, which is saying something. These alleged cultural things are really, they're either myths or they're creation of circumstances, and people created those circumstances and people can change them. Now, there's a legacy. Once you learn to operate in a certain way, it takes time to overcome that. But that's the whole point about the psychology of this younger generation. They are willing to take those risks. They know their value. But not only them, there's a whole bunch of people in their 40s whose kids are now out of college, they're on their own, they can afford to take a risk, and they are joining startups. And they have managerial experience, which is great. And you ask them, why are you joining a startup when you are at Itochu or some big company? And they say, because this is the last chance in my career to do something interesting. So there is this, the attitude is changing because people's sense of what is possible is changing, and they act on it, and they want a life with individual fulfillment. And one way to express that is to actually build something in the business world. So you have to really, I think the problem now is not psychology, it's the circumstances. Anyway, that's my take on it. Wow, that produced a lot of hands.
Okay, so we'll go Jan.
I'm Yann Rousseau with the French newspaper Les Echos here in Japan. I loved it.
Really well.
I keep on writing with you. Exactly the same thing. So I totally, I understand what you say, there's a potential, but what are the actors of change? Because the LDP is in power, there is no opposition at all. As you say, they are helpless. Media are not, the media don't do their job here. They are agents of conservatism, not have change at all. So there is no criticism. So where could it come from? Young people, they don't vote at all here. So, and when they vote more for the LDP than the older generation. So what could today in 2024 start a change? Where could it come from?
Well, as I said before, you know, what you see, first of all, the reality on the ground, where the entrepreneurs, there are enough of them with enough employees. Professor Waseda, I knew, looked at sort of the new companies on the stock market, and he found that something like a third to a half of the founders had formerly been employees either of Rakuten or Recruit. And so that becomes a breeding ground for new entrepreneurs. And as they become big enough and they do well and have money, they become another of an interest group. And as an interest group, they can begin to have some influence. And then if they can get a little bit of reform here, a little bit of reform there, that moves things, they become even bigger. There's a snowball effect. The other thing that happens is that very often there are institutions, and this occurs in a whole bunch of countries, there are institutions that look very strong and very stable. And then there's some kind of a shock effect, and suddenly they collapse. I mean, the Soviet Union just sort of collapsed overnight is a very prime example. But look at the LDP, the idea that the LDP was going to be around forever, and there was a corruption scandal. It's fascinating how often in Japan these changes are triggered by corruption scandals. And Japan certainly has a large supply of corruption to have scandals about. And so when the LDP fell from power in 1993 and split, that was a corruption scandal. So you never know when it's going to happen. You don't know what the trigger is going to be, but things build up. But there is a force in society to which even the LDP has to respond. Even though Kishida's promises were absolutely hollow, the very fact that he felt the need to say them, the very fact that the Kate Onren made as one of his vice presidents this woman whose name I forget, who founded a company, and she wanted them to take a pro-entrepreneurship position. So they issued a paper very similar to Kishida's, but they didn't do anything to really back it up. But the fact that they felt the need to do so is because society has repeatedly voted for people that they thought would bring about change. They just kept changing who they thought would do it. They voted for Koizumi because they thought he was bringing it about. They voted for the DPJ in 2009 because they thought they would bring it about. They voted for Abe, right, in 2012 because they thought he promised to bring it about. But Abe, in the triumphant return of the LDP in 2012, got fewer votes than the LDP got in its landslide loss in 2009. And with every passing election, the turnout is less and less because people are very disenchanted. They're not uninterested, but they don't like any of the alternatives they're being given. So it would be a lot easier to do this stuff if the opposition got its act together and we really had contested elections, like every other rich country has. We don't have that. But even under the LDP, things could happen, but it'll be more difficult, it'll be slower. But these social pressures are growing, and the splits within interest groups, like what is the interest of big business when they don't want too many entrepreneurs, but they certainly need some, and they can't control these things so easily. It's a very fascinating process, I think, and potentially a very hopeful one. It's an uphill climb, to be sure, but what I'm saying is, I'm not saying it will happen. What I'm saying is the potential, the possibility for it happening is more powerful than it's been ever since the bubble burst. And that's a big change compared to, say, even 10 years ago, when it had no possibility at all.
Yes, in the very back.
Hi, Tom Gill. Hi, Rick. I'm a professor at Meiji Gakuin University, and I've been there for 20 years, and I've met hundreds and hundreds of very risk-averse students. They all, almost without exception, they simply want to get a job with the biggest, most reliable company they can get to. And I can count on the fingers of one finger the number of students I know who became entrepreneurs. I know one. And so I want to disagree with you and agree with the young man who asked the first question. Japan does have a serious attitudinal problem at the grassroots as well as at the LDP level. It may well be that Japanese MBA students have similar attitudes to American MBA students, but we're talking about 50 or 60,000 American MBA students versus a couple of thousand of Japanese ones. You've got to look at the numbers as well. None of the top 20 business schools in the world are in Japan. Of the top 10 countries sending students to American business schools, Japan isn't in there. China, Korea, India, sure. Japan, nowhere. I think the sort of societal, attitudinal problems are maybe deeper than you acknowledge.
Okay, great, thank you. So let me tell you why you're wrong. No, actually, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. And I asked this very question to a professor that I knew at Waseda who runs a venture capital offspread of Waseda. He said, actually, there's sort of a bifurcation in the student body. Maybe not at your college, but say at some of the other colleges, which is you have a small minority which is more adventuresome than the students have been in a very, very long time. And these are people who will, at the top colleges, who will take a chance and create a company. But on the other side, the vast majority of the students are more conservative than they were 30 years ago because the conditions are fragile and their ability to have security is fragile. With even say something in the lifetime employment system, if you're don't get hired for a regular job and you end up having to have a non-regular job, you'll probably never have a regular job. It's very, very rigid, as it is in many countries of Europe. And you've got this bifurcated labor force. So you better get it, or you're really going to be in trouble. Among young men in their early 30s, among those with regular jobs, 70% are married. Among those with non-regular jobs, only 25%. So this whole system of non-regulars is also adding to the demographic crunch. So I talked to a professor at one of the universities who was explaining to his students about really it's against your interest to become an entrepreneur. At the end of the class, he asked how many want to become an entrepreneur, and nobody raised their hand. Well, no, duh. He just told them they couldn't. On the other hand, at Keio, there's a professor named Kotosaka. And when he was a student, he created his own company. And that was such a weird thing to do that NHK came, I think it was NHK, and they put him on TV for about 15 minutes to explain this weird guy. But he was very, very successful, got quite wealthy. He got his PhD, I think at Oxford, came back, and he became a professor at Keio. He mentored students, and he's on the board of about 4 very, very successful entrepreneurial companies. He's got a class on entrepreneurship with about 100 students. He brought in the head of Rakuten's international division, and they had a contest. They divided the students into 20 groups of 5 each. They had to create a business plan for a new company. The prize is that the best plan Rakuten would finance to actually happen. Now, it turns out it was not one plan, but 3 plans that this executive from Rakuten thought worthy of being financed. So at the end of the semester, the professor said, how many of you would seriously think about becoming an entrepreneur? Half the hands went up. Now, the reality is, okay, they're thinking about it that day and they're excited, but they're not going to do it. But suppose 5 or 6 or 7 did. Remember the chart where it was 6 out of 100 in the typical country and 2.5 in Japan who created their own companies. So you don't need that many of people to become the people who create companies. You also need the people who are willing to go work for them, right? And with the whole growth of the non-regular and all kinds of other stuff, there are more people who are willing to work for them. One thing that could be done, which would make even more people willing to work for them, is Japan has got a law that says equal pay for equal work, as between men and women and between regulars and non-regulars. The law is not enforced. And there's no class action suits here. You'd have to do it on your own. The government does not enforce it, right? But if they did enforce it, then people would know if they left a big company and went to work for a smaller company, and it failed, as most do, they could get a job back, and it may not be a regular job with an indefinite contract, but it would be the same wage. There are labor inspectors who are supposed to inspect these things, but they don't. They consider it a contract issue. The courts, rule in favor of the companies by saying, well, the job really isn't different because 0.5% of it is different. What I'm arguing is a lot of the attitudes are products not of some inherent culture, but of circumstances. But once those attitudes are inculcated, they become part of the mindset, and they are hard to overcome. But you don't need to change that large a share of the population to create enough entrepreneurial companies to really have an impact. And I'm saying is there is a minority section of not only people in their 20s or 30s, but even in their 40s. You see in the stats, the number of people who do switch jobs. You see the people who went to work in the 80s and then the 90s and then the aughts. The share of people who, having been with a company for 10 or 15 years, stay there for another 10 or 15 years. With each passing age cohort, there are fewer and fewer who do. And so there is a real change on the ground. So what I'm saying is that the experience that you have is absolutely real. I totally believe it. I'm arguing it's only part of the story. There's another part. And they're both going on at the same time. Part becoming more adventuresome, part becoming even more cautious. And the part more cautious is a lot bigger.
Thanks. Samuel Leiter, I'm a PhD candidate in political science at MIT. I was wondering if you could say political science.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the reasons why the MOF and other major ministries and the politicians are listening to big companies. You mentioned that some of them genuinely want to improve Japan, they care about Japanese growth, and yet over and over again they do things that squash entrepreneurship. So what are the motivations there? Is this a descent from heaven story, straight corruption, or something else?
It's actually more interesting than that. I mean, that's part of the story, sure. But, in the high growth era, you did not actually need a government finance social safety net, because you had high growth, full employment, lots of social mobility for the son of a sake brewer with very little formal education to grow up and create Sony. And lots of people like that. We don't even know how many people who failed and tried again and just got a regular job. And you had very equal distribution of income. So you had equality of income and security of income, so that your job was the social safety net. Well, when growth slowed down and you have the high growth era, the government did not want to switch toward, in general, creating a social safety net, except in one area, which was healthcare. You have a government financed or partly financed in that way, universal health care, which both the right and the left agreed had to be done. And actually, the stronger the opposition, the more the LDP did things that benefited the people, whether it be universal health care or the pollution diet that really sort of cleaned up the filthy air. So competition is important in politics as much as elsewhere. So then in the absence of a government-financed safety net, what was the safety net? The safety net is your current job at your current company. So therefore, if you let companies fail, people are going to lose their jobs, and they may have trouble getting another job at anywhere near the equality of income. People who are, and it's not just at big companies, at the other end of the scale, people who are forced to retire way too early as the lifespan expands, they form these mom and pop companies. They get government loans or credit guarantees for bank loans. It's kind of disguised welfare. A banker told me that Japan was organized so that society's losers don't feel like losers, because no one wants to be on welfare, right, in any country. So it looks like they got a job because they're running this little shop outside their home, and they're mixed together. So that they support the incumbents because there's immense political pressure to do so. Otherwise, you're going to have a huge social upheaval and dislocation and suffering. And then the MOFs will say, we can't afford to have a social safety net because you've got this budget problem. Well, the reason you've got the budget problem is because you're not growing, and the reason you're not growing is because you don't have the social safety net, is one reason. I would argue you can't afford not to have one. But that's a big fight. As I said, in healthcare, it's been done. In education, Japan spends the least portion of taxpayer money on public education. And as a result, you have, on the test, Japan does great. But say the lower half of bright students, the brightest of these students, if they're in the lower half of the income scale, a third of them say, I'm not going to be able to go to college because I can't afford it, which is a really sad statistic. Japan is wasting its only real resource, which is the talent of its people. So it's not just to send, that's too simple a story. It's much more profound. There is a real problem of how do you get from here to there? How do you do it? And how do you have a situation in Scandinavia? They have what they call flex security, which is being flexible and security. So as people lose, companies rise and fall, people die, but the government does things to finance the ability to transition from company to company with retraining, with matchmaking between companies and people who need jobs. And as a result, long-term unemployment is very, very low. So you're not paying people just to sit around forever. Now, building such a system, you don't do it overnight. But the principles are right, and there are things that, again, Japan can do to move toward it. It's difficult, it's not easy, but there are other steps which are nowhere near as hard as that, which begin to get the ball rolling. Those could be done. Solving this problem of the social safety net, that's a much, much more difficult thing. So politically, it's important not only to do the right things, but to do the right things in the right order. Start off with stuff which is easier to do and people can see immediate payback. This is what Deng Xiaoping did in China. I mean, he was a genius at sequencing. So that, that's sort of my take on it. Last night you were going to ask this question. So go ahead, shoot.
So my name is Sandy, and we help companies to transform to become more agile and inclusive. So, and by the way, in my home country, which is Belgium, the average age to create a startup is 42 years old. So we talk a lot about students, but we also think about more older people. My question is, what is your advice to have more women entrepreneurs? And I'm not thinking about having a hair salon. I'm thinking like us, my colleague and myself, we're coming from the tech industry and the life science industry. So what would be your advice to have more female entrepreneurs?
You know, it's a really, really interesting question. I think there are two things I think that ought to be done. First of all, there's the issue of promotion. In most countries, the people who start companies are between the age of 27 and 43. 27 because the best people to create companies are people who have at least some experience in a business and maybe reach the level of, say, Cacho. And they know, because a lot of people have got great ideas, but they don't know how to manage a company. And so the company fails. So if you have that experience in managerial situation, you can do it. What happens when you have an aging country, not only does it take longer for people to become to these managerial roles, but if you compare men and women, there's such a discrimination that I have a chart in my book. It's a very good book, by the way. I would recommend that you get it. I read it, and wow, it's good. And it makes a great birthday present and all kinds of stuff.
Wedding presents.
Wedding presents, too, and
Funerals.
not so much. Because they're over 40. No, not so much. Not so much. So it might be that the manager, you know, you say the Kakarocho and Kacho, Bucho. So whereas a man might become a Bucho at, first of all, later than it was 20 years ago because of aging. But where he might become a Bucho, let's say at age 35, a woman will be age 50. Well, you know, you're not going to start a company at age 50. I mean, some will, but most won't. So one is to actually enforce the law about equality of pay and promotion so that women have that managerial experience because they're the most likely not only to try to make a company, but when they do try, they have a much greater chance of being successful, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is the banks simply discriminate against women. And actually, I don't know if it's against the law. It's against the law for companies to discriminate in pay and promotion. Maybe somebody else knows. I haven't looked at it. If it's against the law to discriminate women in bank lending. I forget when, maybe somebody knows. It was not that long ago when in Japan, as it was in almost every country several decades ago, women could not get a credit card. Their husband had to get it for them, right? You can get a credit card, but the point is there's a lot of really backwardness. And so between the promotion issue and the ability to get financing, those two things would be the biggest obstacle. The only other obstacle I can think of, which is sort of harder to say, but I suspect is whether there are people who are more willing to work for a male boss than a female owner. But I still think there's a part of the age cohort, which is a little different, which would be willing to work. That's a much, much harder problem to solve, and I don't know the extent to which that is a problem. But again, start off with the things which are easier to do and produce some results and build on that. Those are the two things that occur to me. That's not such a bad question, you know. I thought it'd be much tougher than that. Easy for me to say, but though, by the way, just, you know.
Yeah, there's a question in the back just behind you.
No. Okay. Hello. I'm also teach at Meiji Gakuin University. Hello, Rick.
Hi.
As always, an excellent talk. My name is Paul Midford. And my question
You're going to
is...
explain why Tom is wrong?
For the sake of harmony in our department, I think I'll pass on that one.
No, he's right. He's just part of the story.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, I'm gonna give another part of the story that might also be wrong, but here it goes. I think you've done a very persuasive argument that there's nothing in Japanese culture that prevents innovation. As you pointed out in the 1960s, Japan was much more innovative society. You also point to this minority of younger Japanese who are also very innovative. But you also said that in order for them to succeed, you're going to have major changes in policy. like banks have to, as you were just saying, banks have to start lending, or you have to have these angel funds or these other things in order for this wave of entrepreneurs, younger entrepreneurs, to be successful. And here's where I want to go back then to the issue of aging. Japan is a super aged society. And there's a persuasive argument out there that super aged societies are much more risk averse. So this makes Japan different than it was in the 60s. Japan was a very young society, now it's a very old society. So the question then becomes, will this get in the way of the kind of change you think Japan needs? And related and kind of reinforcing that is something you've also talked about, this pervasive pessimism we've seen in Japan over the last 20 years or more, which is things, no expectation that standards of living are going to go up, and also this association of change with things getting worse. As you know, I look at renewable energy a lot, and there's polling, comparative polling, looking at renewable energy and whether measures to fight climate change will lead to green growth, will lead to a better economy. Japan is much more pessimistic. In other countries, polling shows people think renewable energy and fighting climate change will lead to higher standards of living. In Japan, it tends to be believed that this will lead to lower standards of living. So taking those two factors together, can we really, I mean, how can we, is it possible, and if so, how, is it possible to overcome this kind of pessimism in a very risk-averse and old, aged society? That's my question. Thank you.
I think it's your questions. Can we ask someone ask a less intelligent question, please? Yeah, I don't like your audience.
It's the last one.
No, we got time.
It's the last question because we're ending in like 8 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
well, I'm not going to take 8, 9 minutes. Anyway, okay, aging. Aging is a double-edged sword. Okay, my next chance to say supply and demand. I'm going to say it was 5, even though it was just 3, because, hey, I'm running the show here. So, on the one hand, aging creates more demand for reform, right? Because you cannot finance the aged unless you have better growth. And they do vote. On the other hand, sometimes their attitudes are very conservative. It gets very, very complicated. And politics is way above my pay grade. I mean, stick to. Anyway, on the other hand, you're absolutely right that older societies tend to be less entrepreneurial. If you have most entrepreneurs being in this 27 to 43-year-old group, well, as you age, there are fewer of such people. But moreover, as you age, there are older people who haven't left their jobs, particularly with the lifetime employment system, where these cadres of 75 are still sticking around and doing nothing in magazines I've worked for, right? And so the slots to open up, there are fewer slots for younger people to step up to a managerial role, and therefore a lower portion of those in the 27 to 43 have got that vital experience. So that's why I say there's kind of a race of the age wave, which is, it's not good enough to say, Japan is changing, be patient, things take a while. But yeah, if you had 100 years, great, but because of aging, you don't. So are you moving enough, fast enough? And that's a real problem. And, so I don't have a simple answer for you, but it is absolutely something that people have to really think about when they say, well, give us time. Japan goes through these, I wouldn't say, I think it's a bit more complex, the pessimism. It sort of goes through these waves of irrational exuberance and then irrational pessimism. And people raise their hopes. Koizumi's going to do it. Abe's going to do it. Why this stock? I mean, a friend of mine, his wife was sort of my personal Mrs. Watanabe, who back in 2013 was absolutely sure that Abenomics is going to work because the stock prices were rising, and it's the smart people who invest in the stock. So if they're investing in it, they must know. It must be happening, right? And then all these, so that we've had in 2005 the rush to support Koizumi, in 2009 the DPJ, in 2012 Abe, that people did vote for hope and for change and then got disappointed, become pessimistic. One of the purposes of the book, and actually my former editor at Toyo, Keizai, who then became president of the company, I sent him the introduction and I sent him the outline. And sort of I have all the problems, how it's going to be solved and why it can be solved. He goes, you know, you have this, Japan can do it in chapter 14. No, at the very beginning, I want you to write a love letter to the Japanese people between 20 and 40 saying, yes, you can. Yes, you can. And here's why. And actually one of the purposes of the book, because the purpose of writing a book and selling books is actually to communicate and send a message to people who you think be part of the dialogue, and to say, yeah, it can be done, not as pep talk, cheerleading, but to really demonstrate how the necessary changes come out of indigenous trends within Japanese society. You're not grafting some foreign model onto Japan. And to really show, to illustrate that this thing really could happen. And while some things do involve gigantic changes, I think maybe it's repetition is the soul of wit. Start off with things that are easier to do. It's not a gigantic task to switch the R&D subsidies. It's not a gigantic task to do things with limited liability companies and double taxation and all sorts of other angel funds. These things can be done within the existing system. Now, other things are much, much harder, but get something accomplished to depth, one, because of the results it'll produce on the ground and the snowball effect, but also to show that things actually can happen. And there'll be a realistic then basis for cautious optimism. So that's my gut feeling. I could be wrong, and I hope I'm not, but it's certainly worth taking the chance and pushing for it.
I'm going to take advantage of my control of the mic to ask the last question. You've painted a fairly dire picture of Japan as it is today, at the same time being very optimistic about what could happen. The one question I have is, if you look at the United States, at the UK, and at several EU countries, you have a large percentage of voters, sometimes a majority, who essentially support parties that want to destroy the system. Interestingly enough, here, we don't have that. So if you look at the politics, and you compare Japan, the UK, the US, France, Germany, Italy, you'd say, well, looks like the Japanese are pretty satisfied with the system because they don't support politicians who essentially want to abolish liberal democracy or want to overthrow the system or what have you.
What's the question?
Well, the question is, so why, in a way, if Japan is in such a bad situation, why is it that the public actually looks less dissatisfied than American or European voters?
It's a really interesting question. So it's a really interesting question, and so let me try to have a really interesting answer. In multi-party democracies, where parties do alternate in power, people are sort of used to fighting City Hall. They're used to being able to change this set of bums out, and you get a new set of bums, and you throw them out, and things change, and there's progress. One of the things that's happened, and there's really wonderful studies on this. First of all, in US and Europe, there's a history when there are huge financial crashes that disrupt a lot of the middle-class savers and like that. There's very typically, very often, a rise of right-wing populism. The left doesn't do quite as well because they're too internationalist. And one of the things that's happened is people did surveys of various election districts in Europe and in the United States. They found that where you had working class, left of center populations voting. When people were losing their jobs or having real wage cuts because of automation, there was a rise of racism and nationalism and anti-immigrant feeling and anti-trade feeling. Now, why would that be? Because people don't like to think their life was disrupted by impersonal forces. They would really like to point to a personal culprit. And whether it's Le Pen or Trump or Alternative for Germany or whatever it's called in Denmark and Sweden, they have certainly pointed to the liberal elites cooperating with the scum of the earth in these shithole countries to destroy our jobs, especially when they have a different color. Right? And this has happened all over. And that they don't want to believe it was automation. If there were no time to do it, but anyway, I'm not going to do that. In Japan, you have an opposite problem, which is, and this is in hierarchical societies, and including in one-party democracies, that where they inculcate passivism, passivism, not pacifism, being passive, feeling helpless, it's called in psychology, learned helplessness, that you can't fight City Hall, you can't change things, shikataganai, right? It can't be done. And what happens is, actually Alexander Hamilton said this, he said the problem with monarchies is not that you get bad kings, which of course you do. The problem with monarchies is that people who should be citizens learn to act like subjects, and they learn to turn out. Karl Marx said, where you have censorship, people don't even bother trying to get information. They become apathetic. It can't be done. And so authoritarian societies tend to create that sort of thing. And so, you know, that may not be the answer to your question, and I really don't know what the answer is, because I asked the same question. But people, I don't think that people are satisfied. I mean, everything shows people are not satisfied. Because when they have a chance to change, they do come out and do it. If you look at social pathologies, you can see things there. I think what is more is people feel powerless. Why bother to even try? Because it's not going to work. I remember in the United States when the anti-war movement sort of ended and society was not miraculously turned overnight, we got the me decade, where people then were more interested in their personal exercise than in politics. I mean, this is not an unusual thing. So that's not a complete answer to your question, and I wish I had a better answer, but on short notice, that's sort of the best I can come up with.
Thank you very much. You know, I very much liked your argument about the fact that culture changes, because when you arrive in Japan, you're often told, well, this is a consensus-based society, everything. If you look at mortality statistics for politicians in the 1920s and 1930s, one of the key causes of death is assassination. So it's not like Japan has always been consensus-based. I mean, except if you consider if assassination brings consensus.
Yeah.
So I think, so thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't address all your questions. And again, take this leaflet and you get a 30% discount. And so we advise.
Advertising. You get 30% discount from a price that Oxford has actually made very high. So if you look on Amazon, this will cost you less than it would cost to buy it on Amazon, especially when you include the shipping. But the difference is maybe 500 or 1,000 yen. It's not, you know, it's not, there's a little bit of a...
It's worth it. It's worth it.
Anyway,
I'm reading it. It's
at any price.
Yeah.
You're getting a deal.
Yeah. No, you're.
And if you buy 3,
So thanks again. Thank you.
my mother very happy.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. I would like to thank Evelyn, who organized and set up the entire event, and all our student workers, many of whom are here. So thanks again, and we look forward to welcoming you to other events. So thank you. Thank you so much, Rick.